What happens when you hunt one monster, only to unleash another? After a relentless chase, Alexander the Great finally has Bessus, the man who murdered King Darius. But the very act of capturing him unleashes a far deadlier enemy, trapping Alexander's army in a brutal war they were never prepared to fight. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Immortal History. In our last episode, we saw Alexander unleash his fury on Persepolis, burning the magnificent ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid Empire to the ground as a final, terrible act of vengeance for the Persian Wars. With the palace in ashes and its immense treasury secured, Alexander turned his focus eastward. His sworn objective was to hunt down and punish Bessus, the man who had murdered Darius III, and audaciously declared himself Artaxerxes V, the new King of Kings. This great chase would lead Alexander and his weary army over the towering snow-covered peaks of the Hindu Kush and into the unknown, hostile territory of Bactria and Sogdiana, what is today modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. But the capture of Bessus would not be the end of the war. It would be the beginning of a new and far more vicious conflict. This is the story of Alexander's most grueling campaign, a desperate 3-year struggle against a new kind of enemy, a brilliant guerrilla commander, and the bloody war that almost broke the Macedonian army. With the ruins of Persepolis still smoldering behind him, Alexander initiated the epic pursuit of Bessus in the midsummer of 330 BC. What followed was a grueling testament to his relentless, almost superhuman drive. He forced his army onward at an unbelievable speed, covering immense distances through sun-scorched deserts and rugged, unforgiving mountains where water was scarce and morale was a precious commodity. Bessus, who had audaciously crowned himself Artaxerxes V, fled eastward, desperate to rally support in the far-flung satrapies of Bactria and Sogdiana. To slow the Macedonian advance, he employed a scorched earth policy, methodically destroying crops, poisoning wells, and burning villages. Yet, he fatally underestimated the sheer force of Alexander's will. Conventional military wisdom dictated a pause for the winter. But Alexander was not a conventional commander. In a daring move that bordered on madness, he led his army across the formidable Hindu Kush mountains in the early spring of 329 BC, a time when the high passes were considered impassable. His men suffered terribly from deep snow, blinding blizzards, frostbite, and severe food shortages, but they emerged on the other side into Bactria. The gamble was a strategic masterstroke. Bessus was utterly stunned by Alexander's sudden appearance, which seemed to defy the very laws of nature. He panicked and fled north, seeking refuge across the formidable Oxus River, ordering his men to burn every available boat to prevent Alexander from following. His support among the local Bactrian nobility, already shaky, began to completely evaporate. They had little faith in a regicide who refused to stand and fight, a king on the run. Alexander, arriving at the riverbank and finding no boats and no timber in the desolate region, was undeterred. He ordered his men to perform a logistical miracle. They were to construct makeshift rafts from the leather tents they used for shelter, meticulously sewing the hides together and stuffing them with dry grass and reeds to create buoyant floats. In just 5 days, his entire army was transported across the nearly mile-wide river and into Sogdiana. The psychological impact was devastating. For the people of Central Asia, seeing that Alexander could not be stopped by deserts, mountains, or even the mighty Oxus, was to witness the arrival of a force beyond mortal reckoning. Bessus's remaining followers lost all heart. 2 of his own commanders, the Sogdian warlords Spitamenes and Darius, realized the chase was over. They arrested their self-proclaimed king in a small village and handed him over to Alexander's general Ptolemy. After a year of relentless pursuit, the great chase had finally come to an end. With Bessus finally in his custody, Alexander possessed the man he had pursued for over a year across thousands of miles. His objective was never simply to eliminate a rival, it was to stage a powerful and unforgettable piece of political theater, a lesson about the sacredness of kingship and the dire consequences of regicide. He was the avenger of Darius, the legitimate successor, and he would dispense justice in a way that both his Macedonian veterans and new Persian subjects would understand. Bessus was brought before him, stripped naked and bound in heavy wooden chains, a fallen king reduced to a spectacle of utter humiliation. Alexander, a man whose character swung between incredible magnanimity and shocking cruelty, first ordered him to be publicly flogged before the entire army. Then, in a gruesome act that deeply shocked his Greek and Macedonian officers, he ordered Bessus's nose and ears to be mercilessly cut off. This was no simple fit of rage, it was a cold, calculated political act. Mutilation was a traditional and deeply symbolic Persian punishment for rebels and traitors, the very punishment Darius the Great had inflicted upon a usurper 2 centuries earlier. By adopting this brutal custom, Alexander was performing for his new subjects. He was acting not as a foreign invader imposing alien laws, but as the legitimate Persian king of kings, upholding the ancient laws of the empire he now ruled. The final act of vengeance was even more horrific, designed to be seared into the memory of all who heard of it. After being publicly displayed in his mutilated state as a living warning, Bessus was taken to Ecbatana, the very place where he had committed his crime. There, while accounts of his death vary, the most widely reported version, described by historians like Plutarch and Arrian, is a masterpiece of symbolic horror. He was executed by being tied to 2 tall trees that had been forcibly bent down to the ground. When the ropes were cut, the trees sprang back to their natural position, tearing his body apart. This slow, agonizing death served as a terrifying and unambiguous warning to any satrap, nobleman or pretender who would dare to challenge the new undisputed king of Asia. With the Kingslayer so spectacularly destroyed, Alexander believed his conquest of the Persian Empire was, at last, truly complete. He was profoundly and dangerously wrong. Just as Alexander was founding a new city, Alexandria Eshate, or Alexandria the Farthest, on the banks of the Jaxartes River, to serve as a fortress and a symbol marking the new northeastern boundary of his empire, catastrophic news arrived that threw his entire campaign into chaos. Spitamenes, the very same warlord who had so cunningly handed over Bessus, had ignited a massive, coordinated revolt that swept across Sogdiana and Bactria like a brush fire. The Macedonian garrisons left behind in cities like Maracanda, the wealthy capital of Sogdiana, were caught completely by surprise. The local population, feigning friendship, rose up and slaughtered them. Spitamenes proved to be a far more dangerous and intelligent opponent than Darius or Bessus had ever been. Allied with fierce, nomadic Scythian horsemen from the vast steppes, he flatly refused to engage in the pitched battles where the Macedonian phalanx was all but invincible. Instead, he waged a brilliant and ruthless guerrilla war, a style of fighting the Macedonians had never encountered and were utterly unprepared for. His mobile forces, composed almost entirely of expert mounted archers, would appear as if from the dust of the plains, strike with lightning speed at isolated columns, baggage trains or foraging parties, and then vanish back into the endless steppes before the heavily armed Macedonians could mount an effective response. This new form of warfare was a strategic and psychological nightmare for Alexander's army, which was built and trained for decisive, set-piece battles on open ground. The breaking point came in a disastrous encounter near the Polytimetus River. Spitamenes and his horsemen expertly lured a Macedonian force of over 2,000 soldiers, mostly inexperienced mercenaries, into a carefully prepared ambush. Using classic nomad tactics, they refused to close for hand-to-hand combat. Instead, they swarmed around the Macedonian square, circling them relentlessly while showering them with a ceaseless storm of arrows from all sides. The panicked Macedonians, unable to charge an enemy that would not stand and fight, broke formation and fled in terror to what they thought was the safety of the river. There they were trapped against the banks and annihilated almost to a man. It was one of the single worst military defeats Alexander's forces ever suffered. Upon hearing the news, the king was reportedly devastated, refusing to eat or drink for days. For 2 long and bloody years, Alexander found himself bogged down in a brutal, frustrating war of attrition. He was forced to abandon his old methods and adapt, dividing his grand army into smaller, more mobile columns to hunt down an elusive enemy he could never truly pin down. With Spitamenes and his horsemen waging a fluid, untouchable guerrilla war in the countryside, many of the Sogdian rebels along with their families and accumulated treasures, took refuge in a series of supposedly impregnable mountain fortresses. The most formidable of these was the legendary Sogdian Rock, a natural citadel perched atop dizzyingly sheer cliffs, accessible by a single, narrow and easily defended path. It was well stocked with food and water, prepared for a long siege. When Alexander arrived in the harsh early spring of 327 BC and demanded their surrender, the defenders, secure in their fortress, laughed at the Macedonian king below. They tauntingly shouted down that he would need soldiers with wings to conquer their fortress in the sky. Enraged by their insolence and driven by his refusal to accept any challenge, Alexander made a public offer, a massive reward of 12 talents to the first man who could reach the summit. He assembled 300 soldiers who had prior experience in rock climbing from previous sieges. Armed with nothing more than linen ropes and the iron tent pegs they hammered into the ice and rock, these men began to scale the sheerest, most exposed cliff face under the cover of a freezing, stormy night. The ascent was perilous. About 30 of them lost their footing in the dark and fell to their deaths. But by morning, the stunned Sogdian defenders awoke to the unbelievable sight of Macedonian soldiers standing on the peak directly above them. Believing that Alexander's entire force had somehow taken flight and scaled the rock, their morale shattered instantly. They surrendered without a fight, utterly defeated by Alexander's audacious psychological warfare. It was here, in the aftermath of this impossible victory, that Alexander encountered Roxana, the teenage daughter of a powerful Bactrian nobleman named Oxyates, who had been among those seeking refuge. Ancient historians, such as Arrian, claim she was the most beautiful woman in all of Asia, second only to Darius's late wife. Alexander, who had until this point shown little interest in marriage, was immediately captivated by her beauty and fiery spirit. In a move that stunned his generals, he made a decision that was both deeply romantic and politically brilliant. He would marry her. This marriage was a masterstroke, a crucial step in his strategy to pacify the war-torn region. By marrying a local noblewoman, the daughter of a prominent Bactrian leader, Alexander was sending a powerful message. He was signaling his intent to merge the Greek and Eastern worlds, to rule not as a conqueror, but as a legitimate and integrated king. The act forged a powerful alliance with the Bactrian nobility, many of whom had supported the rebellion, and helped to finally bring the long, bloody and exhausting Sogdian War to an end. The stunning capture of the Sogdian Rock and Alexander's marriage to Roxana marked the definitive turning point in the war. The resistance, which had seemed so formidable, began to collapse as local nobles sought alliances with the new king. Spitamenes, the brilliant guerrilla leader, was finally cornered and defeated in late 328 BC by a large force under the command of Alexander's general, Conus. Spitamenes escaped the battle, but was soon betrayed by his remaining Scythian allies. Fearing Alexander's unstoppable wrath and seeing the rebellion as hopeless, they killed their leader and sent his head to the Macedonian king as a peace offering. After nearly 3 years of brutal fighting, the lands of Bactria and Sogdiana were finally, if uneasily, subdued. The campaign had been the longest, most costly and most vicious of Alexander's life. It had pushed his army to its absolute limit, forcing him to abandon traditional tactics and adopt a ruthless counterinsurgency against a relentless, invisible foe. He had prevailed through a brutal combination of terror, tactical adaptation and ultimately political alliance. The conquest of this remote and hostile region secured the northeastern frontier of his empire and cemented his control over the former domains of Persia. With the last embers of resistance extinguished, Alexander could finally look to the next, and perhaps most ambitious stage of his journey, the legendary and mysterious lands of India. If you were gripped by Alexander's brutal war in the East, charge the like button and claim victory. Your support is the treasure that funds our next expedition into the ancient world. The war for Persia is over, but Alexander's ambition knows no bounds. To see what happens when he marches his veteran army into the unknown subcontinent of India to face warrior kings and their armies of elephants, be sure to subscribe and activate the notification bell. The Battle of the Hydaspes awaits.